my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. I'm going to do a recent reads. As usual, there'll be timestamps, so if you're not interested in this particular book, you can just skip ahead. And as usual, thoughts and comments, inquiries, whatever is welcome in the comments. And I have a very, I guess, much more detailed, in-depth reviews of things on my Goodreads, which is below as well. The first book I want to start with is The Immortal Life of Henrietta by Rebecca Skloot. I did this combination physical with audiobook, and I believe it was read by the author, which was fine. It's like nonfiction, so it wasn't the best narration, but it wasn't the worst. And because it's mostly all just talking about her own story and the science and stuff, it was about what you would expect, essentially. This is about Henrietta, who was diagnosed with a very specific kind of cancer, and when it was excised, it was the first cancer cells that continued to grow outside of the body because they were cancerous, although it took them a while to realize that, I guess. And it is about her progeny as well as her cells living on into now as well, where her cells became a fundamental cornerstone of scientific research because they were the only ones that continued to grow. And so they were used in absolutely everything. It chronicles sort of the overall life and the major scientific breakthroughs that occurred from it, as well as the problems that it occurred. Like, it contaminated many different kinds of experiments, and people weren't aware of it, and set back some research somewhat, quite a bit. It also problematically did not compensate her or her family, and it brought up issues of consent for other people, but unfortunately her and her family's case are so far antiquated that none of the laws that would have taken place now about informed consent existed back then, and so they just sort of have to live with it. There's also like a lot of myths and myth busting that is done. Her family get told a lot of different stories about her cells, and actually like some are quite far-fetched, like she is cloned and alive somewhere in a lab and all this stuff, and a lot of it comes from how scientists treat Black people and other people as well, that they're taking their research from, and just the overall bedside manner, I guess you could say, but also obviously the through line of racism that occurs as well. And so this author herself injects herself into the story, I guess, like it's part memoir as well. It is literally her being with this family, doing this research and telling you about it, as well as like the interspersal sections in which she is, you know, kind of regurgitating the scientific information that she learned, or the interview that she has done with somebody to demystify something in particular. A lot of it is interesting, like I said in the beginning, but it becomes very reiterative, to the point of annoyance, shall we say. It is staggered in a very strange way. The information design, especially for a nonfiction work, I think is not great. It's kind of chronological, but harkens back to a lot of different things. It weaves back and forth in her own Skloot's injection into the story as well. It doesn't make too much sense. And then the things that she goes over, like I said, it is constantly going back and reiterating, because she then segues from, you know, a certain section of time into what the family was thinking and feeling, and nobody had contacted them in that time, or, you know, somebody had, but then they learned that it was incorrect or whatever. It was very much the same thing happening over and over and over and over again. And it worked against the story that she was telling and undermined the actual interesting bits that were in the book. It was also very strange to have her so predominantly inserted in this tale. Like, I I didn't get that much from her own memoir aspects of it. And I would have probably have just liked it completely divested, and then a thorough chronological and dissection of this with the author knowing what is actually interesting and what isn't, because it feels very, very padded. Next, I read Lucy by the Sea, the Amgash #4 series, and I think the finale, but I'm not entirely sure, by Elizabeth Strout. This was shortlisted, was it? I think, for the Booker. I really liked it. I like the entire series. It's not my favorite book in the series whatsoever, though. I think the third book is just hits the perfect notes for it, but I did read them in order, except for the first book I read almost a year ago now or something. And then I read the second and third back to back. And I think the third one is just like the best encapsulation and the best follow through and execution of what she was trying to do in the series. It is about Lucy Barton, who is a writer herself. She grew up very poor, and this series looks at the intersections of like poverty, class disparity, education, and like predominantly, I think exclusively actually, through a white lens. And in this one, she's much older, and it's talking about her time with her husband, William, during the time of COVID. Except the third book had already kind of gone through quite a bit of her relationship with William, and it was called Oh William, so it felt interesting in a way that the COVID fiction is starting to feel interesting nowadays, with a little bit of time passed, but some of it having like a staggering through line for some of the ways that we live and our anxiety and things like that. How they're treated in, I think, Massachusetts. They visit somewhere and they have out of province plates, and they are treated quite poorly for that. I thought that was very interesting. I never would have thought of that either, although I think that took place here a little bit as well. But I'm not sure. There's, as always, some very touching moments. There's a whole lot of empathy for the characters. I think if you are going to pick up the fourth book, you've probably read some of the previous ones, and you haven't, you probably should and not start at the fourth book, though they are technically standalone for each one. I personally think that there's a lot of connective tissue that heightens it greatly if you consume them all in order. But that's just me. Next, I read Tokyo Vice, an American reporter on the police beat in Japan by Jake Adelstein. I gave this also 3 stars. It was middling at best. I read this because I had seen the HBO Max show based on this book, also written by the author. And it's actually surprisingly quite accurate to it. Although I guess it should be if it's the author and the author adapting their own work to a screenplay. But anyway, he was the only foreigner, white American reporter on the beat, and a lot of it is to do with the organized crime division that he got put into, how Tokyo kind of like functioned as a dissemination machine for the paper. Like they are told what they can write and then do that, but there's different ways of like finding your own, I don't know, path to getting the specific information that you want inserted in them, and to pursue a story that you think has more value than just the police regurgitating what you want, what they want written. It's very like seedy, very sexual. He feels very juvenile. He's not all that interesting of a person, at least to me. He seems like quite a douchebag. He fosters like these relationships with this one woman where they have like an open polyamorous relationship. And just from that, you kind of understand his personality probably perfectly. There's very few, I feel, male white polyamorous, sexual positivity people that don't fit in a very specific shoebox of turning out to be douchebags later on. And this guy seems like that kind of a person. Was he effective at his job? I don't know. I don't know if he had that much oversight in this, because it's a memoir that is also the only way that he could write a story that ostensibly the government didn't want written about the Yakuza, formulated as like a sort of narrative nonfiction work, but also a memoir. So it was interesting to consume, but I don't think it didn't work completely. And then it also feels like it needed a fact checker, like, or citations or something. Like, you're taking a whole lot on faith when he is ostensibly trying to insert an article and this memoir of how he came about this into the story. So it just felt very suspect in many ways, basically. Next, I read The Bone Orchard by Sara A. Mueller. I give this 4 stars. I don't remember too much about it, though. It's kind of faded with time. It's very strange. It's very atmospheric, horror-driven, fantasy, dark, and it has a very interesting plot that it would be spoilers to articulate completely, but there's a lot of things going on in this about trauma and memory and a few things like that that are so tied up in the plot that a lot of things don't make sense, and when they do, the revelation is what bumped it up to 4 stars for me. It feels kind of like it's spinning its own wheels, or even nonsensical at times. And then if you have faith in the author, which I did, that punch is coming and it kind of resets stuff. It's also quite queer and has queer vibes. It's atmospheric in that same way, like vibrant, colorful, just very like othering and queer, if you get what I'm saying. Basically, you'll pick it up. And yeah, that's about all I remember of it. I would definitely revisit it on the page again. I think I predominantly consumed it on audiobook, and that's why my memory is a little fuzzy. It tends to be that way for audiobooks unless it was just like super gripping, which generally relies on the narrator being excellent, which in this case it obviously wasn't. They were an okay narrator. Next, I had a bit of a weird streak with this one, Mystic River by Dennis Lehane. I really like Lehane's other work that I've consumed, so this was a little bit strange. I gave it 3 stars. Some of it might have to do with the fact that I have seen the movie already, but I felt like the way that he encapsulates the story in some ways strays into very problematic territory that made it both unenjoyable and undermined what he was actually trying to communicate in the story. It's about 4 boys, maybe 3 boys, I can't remember exactly, who are very young, and their lives are irrevocably changed when somebody purporting to be a police officer asks for them to get in the car to take them home, and is kind of like busting them over nothing, like they're maybe like doing some, it's not vagrancy, like maybe they littered a bit or something, like whatever they were doing, it's like a hugely overborne thing, and it's very suspect. Like all of them are so put off that they don't go in, except for one kid, and he's the one that suffers from sexual assault and is returned to the parents, and this boyhood is sort of like shattered completely. You go into the boys' heads through boyhood, and then it jumps into the future, and you kind of see like what happened to them, what's going on with them. And then the one of the men who has grown up has his daughter go missing, and that's the predominant mystery, but it dovetails into what happened previously and how the community treats the boy, like basically because it is assumed that he was sexually assaulted, he's treated as like a gay person now. And he's ostracized, and the boys weren't there for him when he was returned. It really shapes his life as well as the other boys. One of whom goes into like organized crime because he's so overconfident, compensating for things. There's a few memories that are completely heartbreaking and absolutely exquisitely rendered on the page, specifically conversations between one boy and his mother about manhood and how to be a man, and them not saying things specifically about each other, as well as the possible mental illness of his mother. That was actually excellent. But in terms of like showing how the community is villainous in this way towards the boy, it actually steps on its own toes a few times, even though I think it has the best of intentions. And that really undermines the mystery, at least for me, because I know the end of it because I saw the movie. But also thematically, like the entire capital B point of the book. So 3 stars. I then read this really weird book on audio, Free Billy by Dawn Winslow, who is like a crime writer. This book I also gave 3 stars. It was fine, but odd. It was about a maybe like an hour and a half, 2 hours of this very small short story, I have to imagine, about a surfer who gets like a lot of tail and is very like obsessed with his sexual prowess, falling for a very particular girl. He's like a beach bum. He refuses to have any possessions. He's a surfer. It's very like California in like 69 kind of deal. And it's about him having this like whirlwind romance with this person, and it was just whatever, basically. Like there was nothing completely wrong with it, nothing about it completely sang. The narrator wasn't particularly amazing. It was very odd in some ways. It was very 60s in terms of like inclusion and representation, / lots of slurs and slang, and I didn't identify at all with any of the characters, so yeah, it was just odd. I then tried to read Miyazaki World, A Life in Art by Susan J. Napier. I gave this 0 stars and stopped reading it because it was infuriating how much detail she went into all of the works by Miyazaki, some of which I had not consumed, and she was spoiling gratuitously. And so I was just like, I'd rather just see the movies and get what I can out of them that way first before being spoiled. But also, I just didn't find it that interesting. Like you'd think it would be because his works are so predominant and celebrated, and some of which are very excellent, like Princess Mononoke. I love that movie. But yeah, the granularity of her sort of fangirling about this guy and what he has said in his interviews, I think would be better just seen on the television, because typed out, it's monotonous, dry, boring, and hard to keep your attention to, basically. Next, I read Blackbird by James Keane. I saw the Netflix TV show and then read the audiobook of it, which was quite quick, thankfully. I gave this 3 stars. This was fine as well, and it was pretty close to the actual show, and that was interesting because some of it is very bombastic and odd, and there's like a kind of twist near the end where I was like, that has to be just a dramatic reading insertion thing, because it seems wild that would just suddenly occur, but it did occur. It's the life, well, more of just a memoir, not a biography, of this man who was a career criminal, and again, he's like very macho, attractive, sleeping with all these women. He's a drug dealer. He's got a dad who's on the police force. He's really living it up. Then he gets busted, and oh shoot, I can't remember the name of the serial killer now. I can't remember, yeah, but anyway, a predominant serial killer is like he has an opportunity, a window in which that person is filing for a petition to get out on like falsified documents or some sort of misfiling, something like that. And so they decide to use him as an undercover operative to get to know him and get to make him confess to him as evidence. And it's about that story. The problem is, of course, is if you know if he's in or out of jail, then you know the outcome of the story. And also, you already kind of, there's nothing about the story that will be surprising in any way. Like when you hear the story, you can kind of guess what the outcome is. It is that outcome. You can kind of guess how it gets to that. It is like that. He ingratiates himself. People want to get to know him because he's sort of like alpha male guy, but kind of soft and all that kind of stuff. Some of it is interesting. It's shorter than watching the actual Netflix series, which is like 8 or 9 episodes. That's an hour, and the audiobook is like 5 hours. So there's that. The acting in the Netflix show is exceptional, though. I really liked it, but otherwise, I'm not really sure why it needed to be televised. Like, it's maybe as a documentary, it would have been much more interesting, but as a narrative, it lacks any kind of non-equilibrium or obstacle that feels real, and it hampers it greatly. But it's fine with when it was written. The audiobook is fine. Everything about it is just fine. Next, I read Daemon by Daniel Suarez. I give this 4 stars. This is a cyberpunk staple that always gets recommended to me. It is very genre fiction. It feels like commercial fiction. It is very like Die Hard, guns blazing, except it's a techno thriller. Essentially what happens is there's this very rich guy, think like Edward Snowden, master hacker, rich guy, but is not altruistic whatsoever. He dies, he leaves behind a demon. Did I say Daemon before? It's Demon. And that program is so complex as to be his personality. He's like an AI, and he tries to like take over the world kind of deal. The techno stuff is very well researched, surprisingly, except for the actual demon part, which I don't really buy, but is a good injection for an antagonist, basically. But it is definitely a techno thriller. Like if you like gadgets, if you like the specific protocols and the things that they have to do to countervene this guy, and as like a sort of thought experiment for trying to, in the real world in early 2000, I think this came out, or possibly late 90s, stop in AI. That's really interesting. Otherwise, it's kind of laughable how the characters are cardboard cutouts, archetypical. There's lots of guns, weapons, sex, unrequited lust for the different partners. It's twisty enough that it keeps you interesting. It's better than commercial fiction, which is why it got 4 stars from me. So there's that. And lastly, I read Alan Cumming, Legal Immigrant, which is just a recording of him doing a stand-up show, basically, which I wasn't aware of and probably wouldn't have watched had I known that, but it was fine. I gave it 3 stars. He talks about his club, which I didn't know existed, and about queerness, and about how he basically just talks about immigration, as you might expect from the title, and how, you know, nations are populated by immigration already, the fallacy of right-wing arguments, and sings a bunch, which is very nice. And yeah, it's just a very pleasant thing to consume. I always hesitate to actually rate and talk about these because they're not actually books, are they? Like, they're productions from Audible. They're not really scripted. I mean, they're kind of scripted maybe because he's doing a show, but they're not a book read aloud. So it's odd that that has become like a staple of the Audible diet. And I probably won't talk about them in the future, like unless it is a actual book that is performed in that specific way. I don't think of it as a book or story fiction, anything like that, that is being simply narrated. So it's very strange. And yeah, that's it. I hope to see you again soon, and hope you're taking care of yourselves, and I'll see you next video.